Hey, Destiny, what's happening?
Oh, hey, holy shit. I thought, oh, what's
Yeah,
up?
yeah, no problem. Yeah, I just joined the call. I didn't want to like interrupt you in case you were talking about something. Yeah, I don't know. By the way, what were you streaming about earlier? I know that there were some people who are saying you're talking about like Amsterdam or something. What was that about?
Um, I think I was talking about bicyclers. I'm in Europe for a while, and I noticed the infrastructure for cycling here is a lot better than in America.
Okay. That's cool. I just remember someone messaging me like, this is like the most random thing, but yeah, that's all cool. But yeah, thanks so much for being willing to talk to me. Thanks so much for responding. I really
hmm
appreciate this. I think this is a really cool opportunity, and yeah, I don't know. I just I'm really thankful that you took time out of your day to talk to me. It's really chill.
Yeah, cool.
So, to kind of just get right into it, right? So, Kyle Rittenhouse is the subject, obviously, that everyone's been talking about, yourself, also included. And so, before we get into sort of like my thoughts, like obviously, I think that before the serfs made you aware that I made a video sort of talking about my thoughts on the legal side of it. Since I'm studying law, I just clerked for the organized crime division of the Maryland AG's office. So, I have at least some thing to say about it, and I thought I was able to give like some insight into that.
hmm
But I also, want to talk about. I understand that you are very interested in sort of the moral argument, right?
hmm
And so my first question is, what arguments have you sort of encountered already on the moral side of it, and what have been like your general responses to them, like at least so far?
Um, so
So sorry if that's a really
oh
broad
no,
question.
it's
I can
not
ask
broad.
like
I'm
more
sorry.
specific.
I'm trying to phrase things as kindly as possible. The two
Mhm.
biggest arguments that I seem to run up against is take one is property is never ever worth a human life ever. And then take two seems to be that if you ever start out in the wrong, then you are perpetually and always in the wrong. So that seems to be the two um, that seems to be like the two broad takes that people have. So one is that like no piece of property to be a little bit more fleshed out. For the first one, there's no piece of property that's ever worth killing somebody over them destroying ever. And then for the second one, like if you do something and you start out in the wrong, it seems as though you have to accept the consequences of every single thing that happens thereafter. So people will say, for instance, oh well, Kyle allegedly brought a gun illegally into another state. So anything that happened past that with that gun is now his fault. Are basically the two main arguments that people seem to run with.
Okay. So I'll probably like I can just nip a little bit because I saw your debate with I saw it with Vosh and the serfs at minimum.
Mm-hmm.
At least as far as the serfs is concerned, like the property argument, I think I fundamentally agree with you on that front.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you brought up the art like the LA riots as an example and talked about like yeah, well, there's some instances where like if you have a marginalized group of people who want to defend their property against like a bunch of like racist ass motherfuckers, that they should be able to take up arms in order to do that. I think I fundamentally agree on that, so I won't waste too much time on that front.
Okay.
Uh, but yeah, a lot of my argument seems to be in the realm, at least, of sort of the second uh, vein of arguments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although I will say off the bat that I do think, because I know that I've seen this point come up several times, if not in specific discussions. I think in specific discussions with you, but with other people,
Mm-hmm.
like this idea that Kyle shouldn't have shot someone in the way that, or shouldn't have used the gun in the way that he did, at least when he was at the event, and that it may have been unreasonable for him to have perceived a threat
Mm-hmm.
from, for example, the people charging at him.
Mm-hmm.
I think I fundamentally at least agree that he could have had a reasonable perception that he needed to use deadly force there, right? Like don't. I think that I think that differing reasonable minds could come to different conclusions onto that just based on like the available footage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have three people charging at him, one of whom has a skateboard, the other with an actual gun,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't think it's necessarily morally impugnable for him to have defended himself in such a way as he did, kind of devoid from other circumstances. I do have arguments going to like how he ended up in that position, but like that aside, right? I don't necessarily hold people morally culpable for perceiving a threat and responding to what they perceive that threat to be, assuming that like that perception to be reasonable, right?
Sure.
So like if someone reasonably believes another person to if someone reasonably believes that someone else is going to kill them, regardless of whether or not that person is actually going to kill them, I think that affords moral latitude to be able to use deadly force in self-protection.
Okay.
So I won't get too bogged down there. So that being said, I kind of have like I wanted to make sure, because I know that in prior debates, discussions, whatever that you've had, that you want, or again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like that you seem to want people to be able to lay out like their fundamental premises and kind of build out from there. So I've gone through and I've kind of fleshed out my own moral argument here, and I kind of start from like the fundamental basics and build out from there. So is it cool if I just kind of like lay out the entirety of it and we can go through it step by step, or do you want to just start from the beginning and go from there?
You can start from and lay them all out if you want. To be ultra clear, when I have these conversations, I don't necessarily expect like every single person to have thought through from like the very foundational, like meta ethical and then metaphysical beliefs all the way down to whatever applied position we're talking. I don't necessarily expect that. I would just hope that people have like thought through why they think the things they do to some extent. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to put like this barrier to like I need like your 10-page thesis on your defense of moral realism or whatever in order to have a conversation with you. But if you want to go through all that, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like it's not like a super long thing. It's basically, I think it's like a total of like, if you want to be like super formalistic about it, 9 premises here and there, but like, it's just kind of like the structure of the argument, right?
Okay.
So just to like go over it broadly, you start with, and this is probably, I think that's something that we will disagree on at the onset.
Sure.
I start with the premise that allowing certain people to open carry firearms itself increases the risks of death or grievous bodily injury, according to academic consensus, or at least some studies I've relied on. And just building from there, based on that, again, like we can go back through any of these premises and talk about them to the extent that you want to. The second one is that this is the likely policy basis for the Wisconsin law against open carrying of a firearm for people under the age of 18. From there, Kyle Rittenhouse knowingly and openly carried a lethal firearm at the BLM event. There's like a video footage link of him, an interview beforehand, where it's like he knows that he has a deadly firearm. From there, Kyle Rittenhouse either A, knew about the law and chose to disregard it, or B, did not know about the law and acted negligently in choosing to not check it beforehand. From there, 5, by choosing to either consciously disregard the law or negligently disregard the law, he also disregards the policy basis for that law. And by disregarding the policy basis for that law, he assumes the risks associated with disregarding that policy, namely that using his firearm could result in the death or grievous bodily injury of another person. So, if Kyle were to find himself in situations where he may otherwise have had a reasonable belief that he needed to use a firearm, by assuming the aforementioned risk, he would have actually and proximately caused those situations to arise in the first place. So, when he killed or caused grievous bodily injury to other people using his firearm, I would say he both actually and proximately caused those outcomes by assuming the risk of having a deadly weapon, despite the policy position that Wisconsin law is based on, and that therefore he is morally culpable for the deaths that he caused.
So
that's basically the totality of it.
Yeah, so my biggest problem with this, if we come at this from a moral point of view, is that it feels hard for me to assume that this is a good argument against it, because it feels like we're relying really heavily on some relatively arbitrary definitions of what is the age of majority. So, for example, like my sincere question would be, if Kyle Rittenhouse was 17 years and 364 days old, then we knowingly condemn his actions as being grossly irresponsible. But if he'd waited 2 hours past midnight and the same event were to transpire, would we all of a sudden say, well, now it's perfectly fine? Like, is that really like the crux of this entire argument, that he happened to be some number of months or weeks less than the age of majority to carry a firearm? Like, is an 18-year-old really that much more responsible with a firearm than a 17 and however old Kyle was?
Yeah, so I can respond to that. I would first make the argument that actually, like, it seems like the academic consensus is that, like, age really doesn't matter when someone is handling a firearm in public. And so, like, my criticism of the Wisconsin law in this instance is that actually it would not go far enough, right? That actually it doesn't really matter whether or not he was, like, 17 and 1 day short of 18 and that he was 18 over. Now, the reason I think he's morally culpable is because in this instance, the law would happen to give him notice, right, that he should have been aware of this policy position that handling a dangerous firearm can lead to a higher likelihood of death or grievous bodily harm. And if the law didn't exist, I don't think he would be morally culpable, because I wouldn't expect him to be aware of that, right? But because the law exists, at least in a limited capacity, and applied to him in this limited capacity, I would say that he either did know about it, especially considering he was a prior police cadet and probably did at least some training with the law. You know, he's Blue Lives Matter affiliated. I don't think it's an unreasonable guess to say he probably knew about the law. Or if he didn't, that this is certainly a kind of law that any reasonable person should have checked on before taking a firearm to an event like BLM, right? So in that instance, I don't really look at age as like the moral qualification. In an ideal world, I think that there should be a law that says that that's just a strict prohibition on all open carrying of firearms, because of the aforementioned research and evidence against the credibility of the idea that having an open carry firearm makes society safer. And that way, everyone would have the same prior notice, instead of just Kyle and people under the age of 18 in this instance.
Do we know for a fact, just as an aside, do we know for a fact that it was illegal for him to have that firearm there? I'm only asking because I see people say things. I've seen a few Twitter threads where people are saying that it's legal to carry a long rifle if you have like a parent with you or some. I've seen a lot of random stuff like that, but I haven't actually looked at the law in Wisconsin for any of it.
So we can talk about that a little bit, because I'm familiar with the counter arguments that people are raising. So this is under Wisconsin law, section 94862A. And basically, like, the law is, so like you start with like the basic law, right? The basic law, like as a starting point, says that it is unlawful to have what the law defines as a deadly weapon. The law defines a bunch of things as a deadly weapon, including like a firearm or something similar, right? Like this falls under the definition of a deadly weapon. And then from there it says, and anyone under the age of 18 who has this in public is guilty of a Class A misdemeanor. Now, there's a caveat to that. There's like there's a series of exceptions beyond that, and the one that people are citing specifically is one about 17 and 18-year-olds being able to use it. And this is where this is going to be tricky, because like this will be something decided in the court of law, right? Because it doesn't explicitly say so, but if you look at like what the law is doing, what guns it specifically lists, and like the legislative history, it is talking primarily about giving 17 and 18-year-olds the ability to use a rifle for hunting purposes, and explicitly hunting purposes, right? So what will likely happen, because I know I've seen some attorneys argue this, right, that this exception would apply. The way I could see this going over in a best faith scenario is if they're able to, like a defense attorney is able to make that claim in trial, is able to sell that argument to a district judge, and then the prosecution appeals that to a higher court judge, and basically makes the argument, Your Honor, this is specifically aimed at allowing people, 17 and 18-year-olds, to be able to hunt with rifles, to expand that interpretation to basically include any time someone wants to be able, at the age of 17 or 18, to be able to use a rifle, especially for something like what we're talking about, would be an unreasonable expansion of what the law is supposed to do, right? In this sense, they would probably make an appeal to what's it's like a Latin interpretive phrase. I believe it's called I'll butcher it, estudem genericis. It's Latin for of the same kind, right? Yeah. And it's basically like if there is a number of things in a list in a law, and there is a common theme among those things, and you can infer from that is what the law is trying to encapsulate, if you're trying to consider if other things would fall under that law, right? Like if you had a law that was trying to regulate, if you had a law that regulated like tugboats, jet skis, and like small fishing boats, you could probably make a reasonable inference that like any other major watercraft would be covered under the law under this principle, right? And is there any like precedent historically in Wisconsin for 17-year-olds being prosecuted for carrying weapons like this? Is that something that's happened a lot in Wisconsin? Do we know? I don't know if that's important or not for this. But... so the first thing I'll say is I don't want to say as much, because like I'm talking primarily like I'm not practicing, or I'm not trying to learn how to practice law in Wisconsin, so I don't know that specifically, and that'll be brought up at law or at trial, right? But for this argument, I also don't think it's as important, because like it's not so much about whether or not he is actually. I mean, like we want to. I want to be careful not to like mince my words, or like I don't want to like split hairs on this. What's important to me is not as much whether or not he was actually like legally culpable, but rather whether or not the law would give him notice that there is this principle that Wisconsin has decided to adopt by the adoption of law, that we should not have 7 or 8 or people under the age of 18 handling a firearm because it could result in death or grievous bodily injury, right? Like, if we want to talk about like the legal implications, I think that it'll, like, it's really messy, and I can't guarantee either way how that's going to go over in court. It'll come down to the jury and how well the attorneys argue and how much they're paid. But like morally, what's more important for me is that like this is a like such a type of law where either he knew about it, right? Like everyone's found it out. Like it's a Google search away. It's not exactly hard to find. Or it's a type of law that he reasonably should have been aware of. And that's what's more important to me.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I fully buy that, like, if you are aware that a certain law exists, that you necessarily agree with all of the underlying, like, moral implications behind that law, and that if you decide to break that particular law and then something else happens downstream from that as a result of somebody else provoking you, that somehow you're morally culpable for that. I could spin off, like, a number of scenarios where I'm just not 100% sure if I would agree that that's, like, that would logically follow, I guess, is kind of where I'm hung up on. Because we're very, very dug into this, like, he was 17, not 18. There's a law that says if you're under 18, you shouldn't have a rifle here. And really, I mean, if we think about why that law might exist, that has nothing to do with what actually happened, right? So, for instance, if he was 17, so let's say, for instance, he was 17 and he was showing his gun off to some friends and shot them, I would be a little bit more warm to that argument. So I say, okay, well, one of the reasons why we prefer adults handling weapons instead of children is because children do stupid things, and a stupid thing a child might do might be showing off his gun to a friend, and now he shot his friend, and this is one of the reasons why we keep guns away from kids. But I mean, like, this wasn't that, right? This was like a self-defense case. Well, that's what's going to be argued in court. We don't know. But, like, it appears to be a case of self-defense where his age or that particular law isn't really that relevant in the case at all. So I'm not sure if I would really look to this particular law to say that this should be, like, or how I would, like, have moral guidance on this issue, I guess is what I'm thinking of.
Well, then I guess that my question, concerning that line of logic would be then what would be the policy basis for this law to begin with? Because really, like, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that, like, the primary policy purpose for this law was to prevent people under the age of 18, if we as a society, or I guess it would be the Wisconsin legislature, determined that people who are under the age of 18 are of such a mental or moral capacity where they are not safe to be able to operate a firearm in public. I feel like this would go to that sort of an issue, right? Or I guess I can't really, like, it's hard for me to see, like, an alternative reason for this law to exist to begin with, right? Like, if it's not to prevent these sort of circumstances, then what would it be to serve? Like, what's the function of it?
Well, I mean, laws exist for a variety of reasons. I mean, a law could exist because a certain group of people, like, believe that morally some moral code needs to be literally codified into law. Sometimes laws are drafted in response to horrific events. So, for instance, I'm totally making this up, but it could have been that a 16-year-old shot himself and a friend on accident, and afterwards there was such public outcry that the Wisconsin state legislature passed that law prohibiting underage people from. I'm not entirely sure why the law was passed. I do think it's not fair to suggest that every law that's passed necessarily reflects some underlying moral guidance. Like, I think laws could be passed for a variety of reasons and in a variety of circumstances, but I mean, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, I can talk on that point, right? So I agree with that, right? I don't think that every law necessarily represents, like, a moral or a sense of moral or morality that we want to necessarily enforce in society. But I would say that there are some laws that fall into this category, right? I would think that a good analogy might be like, for example, like drinking and driving laws, right? Like, there are certainly some people who might very well want to drink and then go off driving, out in society, right? But, like, we as a society sort of acknowledge that there are certain things which you might do in your personal capacity that might make you really happy. But if you do that, it increases a likelihood of everyone around you or the people around you suffering grievous bodily harm or death, right? And so, like, not only is there sort of this this the law itself, right? But there's also sort of the force behind it of like a moral understanding that like drinking and driving is itself something that people should not do. Now if we didn't have the law, then it wouldn't be able to get the people who are thinking unreasonably compared to the rest of people in society. But like it does reflect like a fundamental sense of morality, and I think that that would be a similar case to be made here, right? Like
Well,
this isn't just your average
yeah,
like
I almost
whatever
agree with
law.
you. But I think in order for that to be analogous, if open carry full stop was banned, I think that there'd be a stronger leg to stand on rather than because with drunk driving laws, that applies to every single person. It's not like you can drunk drive once you're 21 or older, or once you're 25 and older, you can drunk drive. You can never ever drunk drive.
I
Now,
mean, like
for
those laws technically, like practically, don't apply to like people who can't drive. Like the law does discriminate. Like driving law does discriminate against people who are underage, right? Or I guess under 16.
well, what do you
So in
mean?
this sense, well, I mean, like we do have laws which discriminate against people in society. It's just a matter of determining whether it's a just or unjust
Well, yeah.
discrimination.
Oh no, no, yeah.
And like,
What I'm saying is that
mhm.
so the open carry law is like well, I don't think that the open carry law is discriminatory by nature the same way that like a drunk driving law is discriminatory by nature. I think these are fundamentally different things, right? Anybody could theoretically well, I guess not anybody, but like drunk driving is like if anybody does it of any class, creed, religion, or whatever, except maybe the president or some diplomatic immunity. Anybody that drinks and drives will be punished for it. But for the open carry thing, this was explicitly for under 18-year-olds. That's why I think it's a little bit different. Like we see that drinking and driving is bad, therefore it ought always be avoided. But for the open carry thing, it must only be avoided if you're under a certain age. Like I think that I just feel like that's a little bit more wishy-washy than like a full stop ban on something versus like you have to be 18 or 21 or 25 or 16 to do something.
Well,
So
how is that? And maybe, and I'm just a little confused. So, like, how is that like a material difference? Like, I get that there's like that distinction that may exist, but like, how does that necessarily affect whether or not Kyle should have been aware of it and like the reason for it, namely that like he, by virtue of having a gun in public, might cause someone else death or grievous bodily injury.
well,
Like,
wait.
the distinction in age doesn't seem material.
Yeah, wait. So what you just said there is not reflected in the law or the purpose of the law. When you said by virtue of having a gun in public, you're increasing the chance of bodily harm, that's not reflected in the law at all. Because if that was reflected in the law, then the law would be no open carry, period.
Yeah, and I agree that there is like I don't think. All right. I gotta. No, I hear that. I suppose that the way I would respond to that is saying that like the law performs the basic function, like it does prevent certain people from doing it, like on that basis. It just doesn't apply equally to everyone. That doesn't mean that the policy basis for that is invalid, right? In fact, we know it to be valid because there have been empirical studies to that effect, right? It's more about the fact that there is a flaw with the law itself, that it doesn't go far enough, right? Like that's just,
Well,
it's not so much like a flaw with the policy, it's more a flaw with the implementation of the law.
Well, that totally depends on how you see the implementation. So, from your point of view, it feels like you, and also I probably agree with this. You feel as though any open carry represents a risk to the public, and the point of that law was to curb at least some of the open carry. But it's entirely possible that some people view it as that law exists just to prevent minors that have never handled a gun before to not open carry. Like, yet people under 18 that don't have experience with a firearm shouldn't be open carrying. In which case, those people would see the policy basis as people shouldn't open carry without like knowing how to handle a firearm. In which case, they might feel like they might have some moral basis by which to violate the law if they feel like they've had adequate firearm training. I'm not saying that any of these are necessarily true, but like I could see that argument being made.
Right, but I don't see. I guess that the thing that I'm a little hung up there that or in that case then is I'm still having trouble seeing like I don't see necessarily the difference in like the material effect on Kyle's actions, whether or not the law initially said that no one should open carry at all versus people under the age of 18, including Kyle, should not open carry, because in both instances you end up in the same situation of Kyle should have been aware of this law which applies to him. Right, like that.
I
like,
think
it
what I'm
seems like
saying
a
is
distinction without.
I think that like I think that I'm trying to focus on the discriminatory nature of this law and its relevancy to an individual agent's determining of whether or not that discriminatory nature applies to them. For instance, if we had a law that banned redheaded kids from taking guns in public, the assumption wouldn't be that the policy basis is that guns in public are bad. The assumption would be that redheads in public are bad, and having them with guns is even worse. So in Kyle's case, the discriminatory nature of the law would be minors shouldn't have guns in public. So his assumption might not be that, well, guns in public are bad, but rather it's people that are too young to properly handle a firearm with guns are bad. So if he feels like that discriminatory nature isn't relevant to him because he feels like he's had adequate firearm training, which if he was like a police cadet or whatever shit he did, he might feel like he like passes that threshold, then I could see him thinking that like, well, I don't think that this necessarily applies to me, or this part of the law isn't as relevant to me. Maybe I'm only a few months away from being 18. I feel like I know how to handle a firearm. Like, I don't think the policy basis for this had people like me in mind.
I don't think. All right, so I don't think that necessarily. Like, we might be using the same words to describe or we might be using different words to describe the same thing, because I think that effectively we're describing like the same. What I picture happened in Kyle's head to have happened. Like, this is what I would call assuming the risk, right? It's like, you know that there is a law which tells you that you should not do something because there are risks associated with doing that thing. And even though he was aware of this, or well should have been aware of this, he consciously chose to disregard it, therefore assuming the risk. Now, maybe he felt that he was justified in doing it, but I would say that altogether, he, like, all the same, he still assumed that risk affirmatively, you know, by virtue of those mental processes that you described.
Yeah, but I think that the reasonable risks that you would associate with it would be things like I might not know how to handle a firearm, or I might incur a fine or some jail time. I don't know what level misdemeanor it was for being caught with it. Not somebody is going to aggress on my life and I'm going to need to respond to that threat with lethal force. Because if that latter was trying to be prevented by the policy, then it would be a blanket ban on all open carry, not just an open carry ban on minors.
Well, I mean, like, again, and this goes to, and I won't dwell on this too much.
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm trying to, I think that, like, we've talked a little bit about this in circles, and I think that we're actually, I don't know, we're either disagreeing with it or using different words to say the same thing. I suppose in this instance. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to rephrase your argument, and then you tell me if it feels like an accurate rephrasing. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is Kyle should, because he has firearm training and was a police cadet, Kyle should understand that a law exists that prohibits under 18s from carrying firearms. Now, we're not necessarily making a legal argument, but rather we're going to appeal to the moral or policy basis by which that law was made. And Kyle should understand the basis behind which that law was made, and the basis is to prevent some harm or destruction coming from an under 18 carrying a gun into Wisconsin. Because he chose to disregard that law, we don't care about the law, but rather because he chose to disregard the basis for said law, he assumes any of the downstream consequences from that disregard, because that policy basis was literally created to prevent what happened from happening. Is that like a fair summary?
Almost. I would say it's not like here. I suppose that, and maybe this is like a clarification.
Okay.
It's not as important. I mean, like, it is important what the initial legislators thought. But like for Kyle, like just looking at Kyle in a moral sense, right? Not necessarily what the law is doing. I think it's not necessarily just whether or not the law actually would have, like how he actually perceived the law, but how he reasonably should have perceived the law, right? And I think that there's an argument that any reasonable person reading that law would take it to mean, oh, there's a good reason that people under the age of 18 shouldn't have guns in public, probably because, you know, guns kill people, right? I don't think
No, I totally disagree. Hold on, I'm so sorry. Okay, I feel like you're sneaking in with this law the idea that all open carry is bad. Every time you say, like, oh, kids under 18 shouldn't have guns because guns kill people, that's not what the law says, and I don't think that's a reasonable inference from the policy basis for that law. The law itself says that people under the age of 18 shouldn't have access to firearms because people under the age of 18 are irresponsible with firearms. But that's it. That's the limit to that. It's very narrow. Kind of like how people under the age of 16 or 15 shouldn't drive. We don't say that because cars kill people. We say that because people under that age can't operate a car responsibly, much the same way that people under the age of 18 probably can't operate a firearm responsibly. I think that's a substantial difference between the two. I feel like that.
So I mean, like a couple things with that,
Yeah.
right? The first is that I'm operating from the fundamental basis that like there is empirically citable authority that any open carrying of a firearm does lead to either death or increases the risk of death or grievous bodily harm, right? Like that's the fundamental basis I am operating from. And so the whether the law necessarily fully encapsulates that itself or not, if it does at least to an extent that it would get like I suppose that what's more important to me is whether or not the law would have given such notice to Kyle or
Yeah.
anyone else like in his capacity to be able to understand that separate but still relevant kind of like empirically validatable truth
Yeah, but I feel
is more
like
what I'm concerned about.
I feel like the law explicitly rejects that foundation that open carry is a hazardous, dangerous thing to do by explicitly allowing people above the age of 17 to carry. So it seems strange to infer that because
I mean,
yeah.
it seems like it's just elaborating on the idea, right? It's not so much like again, and I know that you talked about it earlier, right? Because my understanding of your position is that like, well, because it specifies age, that it's not so much saying that it's dangerous to have a firearm in public. It's saying that there's something about an underage person
Yeah.
that might lead that person to otherwise maybe because of a lack of training, maybe because of a lack of exposure, to not handle a firearm, and because someone might be able to mitigate those factors, that they might otherwise not be morally culpable. Is that like a reasonable summation of your argument?
Yes, yeah.
So basically, like how I would respond to that is not necessarily whether, because I think that is like I think I acknowledge that that's like something that a reasonable Kyle Rittenhouse could have perceived in that instance. But I think that it's also reasonable for him to have perceived the opposite, right? Or rather, I suppose the way that I'm looking at this, that there is a policy basis for not using it, which doesn't go strictly to age, but rather is just encompassing the idea that there are certain people in society or just people in general that that should not operate a firearm or open carry a firearm in public because it could cause death or grievous bodily harm. And it's the fact that that reasonable interpretation exists, which I would say should give anyone who is trying to avoid assuming the risk of those consequences should avoid. Like if you were taking Kyle Rittenhouse, like sitting down and thinking, I'm going to this event tomorrow, or whenever he was called, right? I think he was called by someone else who was there to basically like bring him over to defend the property that wasn't his. So like if he's sitting in his house deciding what to do and he's looking at the law, like he looks up the law online and he finds the appropriate law, the appropriate section, right?
Yeah.
And if he's sitting there and reads it and thinks, all right, there's at least two ways I could interpret this. Either A, this is going to an idea that it's dangerous for people to have a firearm in public because it could cause death or grievous bodily harm to other people, or this is more talking about like the nature of people who are underage and like specific factors that go into that, namely like lack of training, lack of exposure to guns, et cetera, right? And let's say that he considers those two things in his mind. I think that by consciously, and this is, I guess, primarily my argument, by consciously choosing to disregard the former, even though it carries like such a dangerous consideration, even though it carries such a danger of assuming that risk, right? If he were to disregard it, that he could have possibly ended someone's life.
Yeah, so my question is,
that's like the thing that makes him morally culpable.
is there such a danger between the difference between an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old with an AR-15?
I don't think so.
So then that seems to make this whole argument irrelevant then. It doesn't seem like there's much consideration for him to have there, because the law literally says like, well, under 18 it's a really bad thing to do, but 18 and older it's totally fine. I mean, if there's not like if that consideration between being 17 and 18, let's say hypothetically he's like 2 months off of his birthday, like is that really that important? Like does that consideration really apply that much then?
Well, I don't think it really applies so much. Like, again, this would be like a criticism that I have of the law, where I would call for the law to be broader. But in this case, I guess that the way to put it is that it just happened to do the right thing in this instance.
Because
right?
I feel like you're trying to read into this as though this law, again, well, we're kind of circling back to this. It feels like you're reading into this that this law is just any desperate attempt to limit the number of people open carrying. That's how it feels like that's what you're trying to read into this law, and that any open carrying is bad and it ought to be prevented. But the reality is that it sounds like the law, knowing Wisconsin, was probably just drafted to prevent minors from carrying guns. Not that carrying guns full stop is bad.
Well, and I'll be clear about this, right?
Sure.
So just I'm trying to make sure that I phrase it in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is a reasonable thing to expect that the law was drafted to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unless we're looking at like the legislative history, right? There might be like something somewhere that says like the law was drafted to do X, Y, and Z, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could exist out there. I'm not aware of it. I think that there could be, but what I think is that this is an instance where you have the law doing the primary thing that it should,
Mm-hmm.
and then an additional thing to that, right? It captures the idea that we should limit the ability for people to open carry firearms in public, but then it does an additional thing on top of that. That doesn't take away from the validity of the initial, like the first thing that it does. It just adds on to it, right? Like it's just like it's a limitation. It's trying to address a problem, but because people from back then, I don't know, because people are imperfect when they're drafting laws, right? And there's probably like an NRA advocate way back when who was trying to really fight so that, you know, people over the age of 18 could use firearms, right? Any of a number of reasons.
Well, my guess would be that open carry was probably explicitly legal for everybody, and that this law was drafted just to exclude under 18, would be my guess.
Yeah, and I think that's because it gets like the fundamental, like it gets like at the right idea that it's dangerous to allow at least some people in public to carry a firearm, but then it goes like to do another thing that is, in this case, I would say unnecessary and actually harmful, because I would say as a policy purpose that we should have just a blanket ban on open carrying.
Well, but
Concealed
that would
carry is
be
another story.
I don't even know if that's. Yeah, I feel like we're circling because it feels to me like you're loading this with so much as like an attempt to ban. Like if I were to say this limitation exists for any, like for instance, do you think the existence of driver's licensing, like that process is an attempt to get rid of all people driving cars, but they were only able to do it with minors, or?
Wait, what do you mean? I don't think that that's analogous.
I think this is probably where I have to jump in.
What? Okay. What?
Okay.
So I don't think it's super clear to her why this part of it is super important or what you're getting at. So what I think Steven is trying to say is that it feels like from your explanations, the default should be nobody should carry these weapons because they're dangerous, but realistically, the only group that we can limit access to open carry is going to be young people, and so that's how the law works. Whereas I think he's like trying to think of it opposite, where this is going to be something that technically everybody could do, but then we choose an arbitrary like cutoff for young people to have weapons. And Kyle could have thought that his maturity with firearms granted him an exemption to the law. I don't know how that plays into the broader argument, but that seems to be the implication, right?
Yeah, I think I'm assuming that open carry is like okay for everybody, and then there's just some segment of society that's cut off from it, basically. But the default is that everybody would have a right to it, say for like felons or people convicted of certain domestic violence crimes or whatever.
Like we can talk about that certainly. I mean, like if that's a premise that we're sort of like skipping over before going forward, I mean, we can talk about. So I'll just ask just to be clear. So, do you maintain the position that like open carrying a firearm is something good for society? That it's something that minimalizes harm or risk of harm?
I think those two things can be fundamentally different.
Okay.
When you say good,
I just asked the question in like a.
Oh yeah,
you can
sorry.
answer whatever you feel is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, like personally, I think open carry is really dumb 99% of the time. Open carrying, if I had to guess, I don't know in purposes of security, but I would guess that open carry probably increases the amount of harm. But when you say, does it do good for society, there are some people that would say that the trade-offs of whatever harm is caused by open carrying is worth it for the principle of being allowed to open carry. So they would say that it's good even if it causes more harm. So I would draw a distinction between those two things, I guess. But personally, I think open carry it probably shouldn't be allowed. Insofar as like the research I've done on guns, typically the opening of like right to carry arms and everything is usually associated with more gun violence in every state where it's been tried. So it doesn't seem like a very effective way of reducing harm. But some people would defend the principle even with an increase in harm. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. No, and I think I can talk about that for a second, because I mean, when we're talking about people who make that determination, I think that is kind of what I'm getting at, right? Because when you make that determination about like there's this question of what do these people define as like the good that is worth trading off the possible risks in this instance, right? And I think that by people like, and then if we're talking about a firearm, right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the natural good would be the ability to use firearms against people who you feel pose a threat of either death or grievous bodily injury to you or someone else, or I guess the property.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that when we are talking about people who take on that assumption, I think that you get into an area of gray when we're talking about property. And I think that this would have been a very different circumstance if Kyle just like stayed on the property. At least from a moral perspective, I'd have to think more about it. It's a question that I don't want to dwell too much on since it's not necessarily what happened. Like he went there to protect property, but then he ended up leaving, right? So for me, it's more. I feel like there is some moral culpability in the idea that you, as an individual, can make the determination that the risk of using a firearm, the risk associated with using a firearm, that it could cause death or grievous bodily harm to someone, is worth it if the good that you are seeking is naturally to cause the consequence that that risk would cause, right? Like if the good that you're seeking is what the thing that the risk is trying to prevent, that seems like you're just kind of like assuming your way into wanting people to die. That was a loaded way to say it.
Yeah, no, but in that case, so you're saying, I'm trying to do like premise here. So you're saying that like guns exist. So the conservative argument would be guns exist to protect people. I'm going to carry a gun with me to protect people. The only way that I'm ever going to use my gun is to hurt people. Therefore, it seems to be contradictory that by carrying a gun and ever using it, I'm literally violating the whole reason why I'm ever carrying a gun. Is that essentially what you're saying?
I think that captures it.
Yeah.
I don't like. I might have to revise it later. But
yeah,
I think
sure, that's fine. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, okay.
So I think that's fair for the moment.
Yeah. So the disagreement there is going to be that all people aren't equal. So like, if a conservative were to see that syllogism or whatever and then get attacked for it, he would say, "Well, hold on. Guns don't exist to protect all people. Guns exist to protect good people or innocent people from provocateurs or attackers. Sometimes, in service of carrying a gun, you'll use it against an attacker to protect somebody that is innocent or somebody that is not an attacker. Therefore, by virtue of using your gun, you are hurting not people, you're hurting people that are aggressing on you to protect people that would otherwise be innocent. And that would be like a permissible way to use a gun to kill somebody that would still contribute to the good because the person you're killing is somebody that has committed a moral wrong by aggressing on you and showing lethal intent or whatever." Yeah.
Right. I suppose that the way that I would respond to that is that as a policy position, specifically using a firearm, I want to think of the way that I want to say this. I think that there are other ways to be able to achieve that goal aside from just specifically using a firearm, especially with the current literature on like the use of firearms in those sorts of situations and how it can easily escalate situations as opposed to escalating situations. Because if what someone is trying to do is to mitigate a harm, if what someone's trying to do is mitigate a threat, then it seems counterintuitive to use something which has been shown to, rather than mitigate threats or mitigate harm, to instead escalate threats and escalate harm, right? Like that seems counterintuitive.
Yeah. So while that's true in terms of like broad studies on firearms, the only reason why I know anything about this is because I debated this fucking Nazi Vince James on firearms, so I read way too many gun studies. I'm aware of there are a plethora of broad firearm studies. We've probably read a lot of similar ones. I know there was the big one that showed that like if you defend your property with a firearm, I think you had less success than if you used a bat, and you had like equal success with defending without any weapon at all or with a variety of other things, and that just by owning a firearm, there's an increased risk of a lot of different types of fatalities. Suicidality increased, children and accidents increased, et cetera, et cetera. So I would agree in that case. I don't know like hyper specifically if there's ever been a study on the defense of like property with firearms in the cases of like rioting or militias. I'm not entirely sure. It seems like if I were to
come across one.
Yeah, it seems like if I were to grant you that, it seems like we would have to revisit earlier when you said that you felt as though the Koreans during the LA riots were in the moral right. It seems like I would have to walk that argument back to them and say, hey, Koreans, didn't you guys know that just by having firearms, you're escalating the situation and you ought not be here, you need to go home, you're being contradictory?
Well, I think that if we take this argument, I'm trying to think of no, because like I do agree with like that contradiction, at least if we were to take it that way, right? Because I do want to be able to afford people, like for example the people in the LA riots, the ability to be able to defend themselves. I mean, hell, I guess I'm inadvertently making a much further left argument than what I am intending to. But I don't like fundamentally. I am operating from the position that those people are morally justified in doing that. So I see that criticism. I suppose that right now I'm seeing that more. I'm trying to just think through this logically.
Yeah,
I
that's fine.
suppose that in that sense, I would see that more as an exception based on the idea that harm is coming to you and your personal home, kind of like like an analogy to like the castle doctrine,
Well, I
right?
don't think that was
Like
their personal homes. It was their businesses for the Korean owners. They were literally on store
okay,
sites.
but I
Yeah.
mean, like I think that morally I could extend like the idea, like the principle of the castle doctrine to like businesses that are owned by the people who have them, right?
Mhm.
Like I think that there are special rights that are afforded to people to be able to defend like their home, their property, their stores or whatever, right? I think that that is a different consideration morally than just someone walking down the street or walking like in the middle of a crowd of people in a protest,
Well, but we
right? I
don't
think that
know
those are
what wasn't he originally at that gas station? That was like one of the properties they were defending, and he was chased off of it.
well, yeah, he like the story is that he was originally there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, like I still maintain that if he was to remain there, I think it would have been a different analysis. I'd have to think through like how it would have been different, but I'm willing to concede that like it
Well, wouldn't
probably
it?
would have
Isn't
been
it better that he?
substantially different.
Wouldn't it be better that he attempted to retreat rather than just stood his ground and instantly executed the guy like at that prior property? Like, shouldn't we be like grateful that he tried to retreat rather than just stood and killed him instantly? Or
Well, did we know that he retreated?
well, yeah, we see a video of him running away, right?
But that was after, and mind you, maybe I didn't see the videos right. My understanding is that there was first a video where he was in the parking lot, or he was in some sort of lot with cars in it, and he shot someone, right? And that person, I think that there was like an autopsy report, and he had like several bullet wounds, some of which were in his back. So it's probably going to be argued at trial that he shot someone who was fleeing, right?
Wait, no,
And
wait, wait, wait,
after
wait.
that-
This is descriptively
Okay.
very, very, very important. So the very 1st video that we see is him running away from multiple people, one of which has a firearm that he shoots in the air, and then another guy, Jacob, I don't remember the guy's name, the guy that threw the bag and got killed, the first guy that got killed. That guy is chasing him through the parking lot. That's the very first video we see. The very first video we see is Kyle being chased by one guy, Rosenbaum. Yeah, the guy eventually throws something at him, and then Kyle turns once the guy's within arm's reach, and then shoots him 4 times. I think that's the very, very first shooting that we see.
Okay. I just said, yeah, I won't dispute that. That sounds about right. At least based on what I know.
Yeah, so if anything, it would seem to me that him retreating is probably like a show of good faith. What I shouldn't say show of good faith. Let me be more specific. I know under Wisconsin law, I think it. We were reading the sections earlier, but it's like you should like make some effort to retreat if you can, and then once you've exhausted your effort to retreat or whatever, and all other efforts, and you have an ability to defend yourself. But it seems like him like running is probably a good thing, rather than him just standing in front of the gas station just shooting indiscriminately at somebody like coming up to him to like mess with him, right?
Yeah, and I think that, and this goes back to earlier, like I think that in a vacuum, right? Like, I'm trying to think of the way to be able to encapsulate what I'm trying to say. I think that like if we were to for a second divorce this from the idea that he may have had some culpability in putting himself into that situation, because I think that's mainly where my argument is, right? I think that his mental perception, his like him fleeing, right? I think that that is a morally good thing. I think that him doing the things that he did, like I still agree in a vacuum that like his actions, at least in the second video, I don't think that there's enough evidence necessarily in the first video for me to say, conclusively either way.
Sure.
But at least in the second video, I think that he's acting with a at least plausibly reasonable belief that he needed to use at that point deadly force in order to protect his person, or someone else, right? Like I agree with that. It's more I take the issue with the fact that like going back to like the discussion earlier,
Yeah, I
that,
understand.
like, his actions were a but for him bringing a gun there, and
Yeah.
but for him assuming, I guess, that risk. If the disagreements about that aside, that he would not have likely ended up in that situation in the first place.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, so then I'm curious. Okay. Oof. Follow me on this one, okay? I'm going to construct an analogy. You tell me if this is totally disanalogous, you can throw it all out or not. Let's say that you have a state. The law is you need to be 18 years old to drive. That's the law. Let's say that there's a kid, so super common. A lot of kids that grow up on farms learn to drive as early as 9 or 10. It depends on when they get their growth spurt. They can see over the steering wheel. They learn to drive trucks and stuff on the farm very, very early. Let's say that you have a guy that's been driving trucks across the farm for 7 or 8 years. Okay? Let's say that this kid is 17 years old. State law says you need to be 18 to drive. But let's say that, he feels like he's driven enough on the farm, whatever. He's going to drive into town and he's going to pick up groceries with his sister. Let's say that as he's driving into town, let's say that he comes up to an intersection and he goes to drive across. The light is green. He's got the right of way. Everything's fine. And in a totally unpredictable manner, a drunk driver comes swerving out of nowhere and almost collides with him in the intersection. Or rather, let's say he collides with him in the intersection. And let's say that his sister is killed in the passenger seat. Since he was driving and he was underage, is he morally culpable for his little sister's death, despite the fact that that death happened at the hands of another aggressor, and he didn't really do anything wrong, save for breaking the law of being an underage driver?
So the problem with this is that I think that there's one major thing that kind of distinguishes this from the facts that we're discussing, and it's primarily that there's not a risk, or there's not like such an overbearing risk associated necessarily with driving in the same way that it is with handling a firearm. Whoa, right? Like everyone in society.
I think I'm gonna.
Yeah, hold on. I'll explain. Yeah. I'll explain that. Right.
Okay.
Like everyone in society, like it's basically a staple where most people who are able to afford to do so and have like such a status in society end up driving a car, right? Like I drive a car basically at least once or twice a week, right? At minimum, right? It's not like I have to go out and do the same thing with carrying a firearm with me everywhere that I go, right? I think that there's a much more particularly moral onus with doing something like carrying a firearm, because like it's used in such more particular circumstances and explicitly for the cause. Like it's aside from like using it for sport purposes, right? Like it is something which is explicitly used to cause death or grievous bodily harm. Like that's the point of guns, unless you're using it for sport. And I don't think that anyone is arguing that he was using it for sport here. Whereas cars have such a like wide latitude of uses, right? That I'm not sure if the person in your hypothetical is necessarily as morally culpable
I don't feel like any of these are related, though. The idea is that he violated a law that we can argue was specifically constructed to avoid the harm of an underage driver driving, and he neglected that law. He drove anyway. He got into a car accident. That wasn't his fault, much the same that Kyle went into a state where there was a law drafted that said an underage person couldn't commit an action. As a result of him committing that action, he was put in a situation where somebody else basically forced his hand at something. I don't know if I don't know if the fact that cars have a different purpose than guns is that relevant, especially when cars are like a leading cause of like harm and injury in the United States. Like a lot of people die. I think it's over 30,000 a year die in car accidents. Like over millions are like injured every year. Like I feel like they're similar enough that I feel like it's. Or go ahead. Maybe you can tell me.
I'll jump in.
Or go ahead.
I think I can respond to that. If you want to, Booksmarts, if you want to go ahead and say something, I think I can respond to that if you want. I'll go.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not like moderating, I'm not impartial. I'm kind of just here to help Destiny through bits like this, like maybe the analogies. So I do think a lot of people are going to see a problem in using an analogy that's not using like a weapon, that's using something that, like Riley said, everybody pretty much in America is reasonably going to use as long as their economic status is such that they like are going to need it. And the purpose of a car is very different than the express purpose of a weapon or a firearm or something like that. So maybe like a more apt analogy would be a weapon, whereas like a car, when you're using that, your express intent is not to harm people. I think it's like completely different.
Maybe this is like a difference in, I guess, like gun culture then. I mean, like there's a lot of places where open carry is just normalized. Maybe this is the Nebraska in talking. Like, I don't know. Like if you go out west past like Omaha, like there's a lot of places where people just open carry. Like I've seen people open carry like in Grand Island, in all these places and nobody's heard of. Like people just open carry. It's not like if you see somebody open carrying, like they're out there to kill somebody. Like you would never expect that. But also, cars can be used as weapons. I mean, obviously, right? Like we've seen that happen in terrorist attacks.
But that's not their express purpose. The way that a weapon is expressly meant to be used as a weapon, it's expressly meant to like cause harm to other people.
Sure, but I don't think I'm getting at the purpose of the object. I'm trying to get at this idea that once you've committed a certain wrong, that you have to accept a moral consequence behind everything that happens past that moral wrong. Like I feel like at that point I can blame illegal immigrants for getting taken advantage of, or I can blame the protesters themselves actually for the cops abusing them. Because if you're a protester and you're out past curfew, then you should accept anything a cop does to you, because it wouldn't have happened where you're not out there past curfew. And violating curfew literally invites police violence. So I feel like that argument can be ran to so many other places. So that's why I kind of wanted to test it with the car analogy. Like, if somebody's breaking a law by driving underage, even if they feel competent to drive, do they have to accept every single moral consequence that happens past that breaking of the law, even if somebody else is the reason why it happens?
Yeah, and to add just one more thing before I mute again, I think it's worth mentioning an argument that Riley had in her initial video, which was that given that this is a law regarding safety and safety regarding a weapon, it is kind of unique that if you break this like safety law regarding the use of a weapon, that you know, you ignored that, whether that was because you thought you're mature enough and it doesn't apply or not. You kind of like took on a lot of safety risks there associated with the weapon that after hearing her, I did kind of like see the value in that a little bit.
Yeah, I understand, but those safety risks aren't relevant to another person aggressing on you and using the firearm in self-defense. Like, that the safety risks are more associated with being a minor and using a firearm like a clueless person, or not knowing, I guess, how to handle a firearm would be my assumption for the law. Or sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, the law doesn't specify that though, right? Like, it specifies age, but it doesn't like specify that purpose for the law, right? That it's just, oh, children are stupid, so that's like it's that and only that's the reason that we prohibit children from being able to use a firearm, right? Like, if not, then there'd be laws against prohibiting children from doing anything, right? Like, there is something particular.
There are absolutely laws that prohibit children from doing anything, though. What do you mean? There's laws prohibiting them from drinking. We've got laws prohibiting them from driving. We've got laws prohibiting them from voting, from participating in the military.
Right.
There's laws preventing children from doing a ton of things.
I'm just talking like literally a law on like I don't know, something very arbitrary, from like being able to buy an orange, right? It would be a law that would exist just by virtue of that fact of like children being children, right? Like, there's something else in the law, right? And here specifically,
I'm pushing on this because I really don't understand. Like, children can't take nude pictures of themselves. Children can't buy cigarettes or alcohol. Children, there's a ton of things that children can't buy. They can't buy video games that are rated mature or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there are going to be like some laws out there that are probably like more or less mature than otherwise, right? I'm not here to defend like every single law against children, but I think that this one itself affords special consideration because, like, the risk of a child violating a law telling them to not buy like an overrated or like a age restricted game is minimal compared to the risk of a child violating a law like carrying a firearm in public, right? One might result in like the kid seeing some titties or whatever. The other is, you know, the risk of like the child like killing another person. You know, like, I don't think that those are comparable.
Maybe we take like a 5-minute break and I totally disagree. I feel like I'm repeating what I said earlier. It really feels like you've assumed that this law was created, and one of the bases of the law is that guns are bad. But I don't see that at all. It's more rather children with guns are bad, and the law is there to just prevent children from getting guns. This idea behind it that guns are bad, period. I don't think, if that was true, I'm willing to bet that Wisconsin has like a million other provisions. I'm sure they've got like courses you can take to get a concealed carry weapon permit. I'm sure they've got all sorts of like licenses you can get for like was it the class 3 federal one that you need for like automatic weapons? I'm sure they've got like special things for that. Like, I'm sure Wisconsin has a whole bunch of things related to guns that make it seem like they're probably okay with you owning guns. They just don't want children to own guns. And I feel like it's really unfair, the reading that you're given, that like, well, he should have realized that this law existed because guns are bad. I don't think that's why the law exists. I think the law just exists, especially because, reading further into the law, kids that are 16 and 17 can have rifles to hunt. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's that overwhelming, like read into it that you're, yeah.
Well, I'm not, and again, I think I said this earlier, right? I'm not necessarily saying that is that is 100, like, we can like sit here and know with 100% certainty that is what the law was trying to do. But like, if we go back to the Kyle Rittenhouse sitting in his house reading the law the day before it happened, I think that it's a pretty reasonable expectation that him reading the law, that probably would have occurred to him, right? That if he took a gun to a public event, that there was a possible risk, especially after reading the law and seeing that there is a Wisconsin law condemning it, that it at least occurred to him as a strong possibility that the law exists to try and mitigate harm and death.
But imagine
right?
if Kyle has like 6 classmates and all of them are 18 and he's turning 18
Mhm.
in 2 months. I don't think that would be a reasonable reading for Kyle to read into that law at all. Like, oh, all of his classmates that he's grown up with are all going to take their firearms. And, well, his birthday's in July, not January or whatever, 6 months. I don't know. Like, all of a sudden now he realizes, well, now it's way too dangerous to do it. I don't think that would be a fair reading on his point at all. I don't think so.
Well, it's not necessarily focusing so much on like which decision he ultimately made, but more about just that he probably and very likely did consider it, right? Like even if he does have those 6 other friends who just turned 18 and are all taking their guns over there, right? I think that it's still like even if he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm totally going to take my gun over there." I think it's not like realistic to expect that he completely just ignored the possibility altogether that if he took a gun there that there was this law that's possibly aimed at trying to prevent death or grievous bodily harm, right? Like at some point, and I suppose that this is what I'm focusing on is that like at some point it very, very likely occurred to him, you know? Like even if he eventually chose to disregard it, that like he at some point registered that in his mind
Yeah, I
before the
guess.
event happened.
Yeah, I guess I just like I can't see that as saying that like this law was created for this reason to prevent like all like death or bodily harm. It would seem more like the law was created to prevent a minor from causing death and bodily harm in a specific way that a minor could, not all death and bodily harm that could result from anybody using that firearm ever. Because as we said, like if he was 18 years old, we wouldn't be using this argument at all. So it seems like this is like very specifically relies on a discrimination against children for a particular reason, that we assume that they're incompetent in handling firearms because it only applies to children and not anybody that would be like a few months older.
Let me ask it this
Yeah.
way then. So let's say that Kyle did, all right, or we won't use Kyle just because like I don't want to like load
Sure.
the hypothetical onto him.
Uh-huh.
Let's say that you have another hypothetical child
Yeah.
who sat down and read the law for the first time. All right, and in reading the law, they came to the conclusion, and independently, right, just acting in their own personhood, they came to the conclusion that even if they weren't going to believe this is what the law was getting at, that it was aimed at trying to prevent people from dying as a result of using a rifle or suffering grievous bodily harm. Do you think that that is an unreasonable interpretation for that person to make?
Yeah. I think that the interpretation more likely is that it's aimed at preventing irresponsible use of the firearm by a minor. That would be my guess. Like if the discrimination in the law is based on age, my understanding would be that the age would be the like fundamentally important part about it.
I'm not asking.
Yeah.
Like the way that I'm trying to phrase it is not what you necessarily would interpret from it, but rather like if someone were to interpret that, like do you think it's like a plausible thing that a person could interpret if they were acting in like a mental capacity similar to what you would expect a reasonable average person in, I guess, Wisconsin to be acting in, right? Not necessarily what you would take from it, but like what another person acting reasonably, believing or thinking reasonably in Wisconsin would take that to mean.
No.
Okay, so
I feel like if
I think that's
yeah.
the hard sell, right?
Well, because like I feel like
I don't think it's a hard.
if I were to read a law
reach.
that bans heroin, my assumption would be heroin is bad. If I read a law that said people under the age of 18 aren't allowed to use heroin, then I would assume, oh, maybe heroin is just bad for kids under the age of 18 for some reasons. That would be, I would never expect that, like, if something bans something for people under the age of 18, that thing must be really bad. Well, no, it sounds like it's restricted to a certain age for some cause. But to assume that because it's banned for children, it's bad, there's like a million things that are banned for children. Like, is voting bad? Or is serving in the military bad? Or is driving bad? Like, there's a million things that are age.
To jump in,
Yeah.
because the chat is freaking out. So she's not saying bad. She's being very specific and saying dangerous. So we might want to like stick on dangerous. And the idea is that weapons are inherently dangerous. At some point, we have to have a cutoff for children wielding weapons, and we've arbitrarily chosen it's 18. I don't even think that she is characterizing like why that law is the same way that you're describing it either. And I'm not sure how that fits in the larger argument. But
Well, sure. Okay.
I'll
I mean, even if I rephrase it as dangerous, like if I saw a law that said heroin is dangerous, or I'm sorry, if I saw a law that said heroin is banned, then I would assume that it's dangerous. But if the law said heroin is banned for people under the age of 18, well, then I'd assume it's only dangerous for people under the age of 18 for a given reason. And that seems to be the case. but maybe people older than that can mitigate the risk or something. Same way that if I saw a law banning firearms for children under the age of 18 in public, then I would assume that there's some reason why kids under the age of 18 can't handle firearms. Not that firearms like are altogether are dangerous or too dangerous for people to have. The same thing with cigarettes, alcohol, anything else.
Right. So I'm trying to think of the way to address that because I understand the criticism, I think. So let me ask you then, what do you criticize? Trying to think of the right kind of a law to analogize to this kind of a situation, because like I suppose that where I'm approaching from, just to sort of explain like where I'm approaching this from, is that I think that like I agree that there are certain laws which limit age in very arbitrary ways, right? Like I'm not going to defend like the young kids being unable to buy like the titty video games or whatever, right? I don't really care. I don't think that there's a major threat to people doing that. I suppose in this situation, it's just very hard for me to imagine that someone sitting and reading this law for the first time would authentically and only, right? Like we're not talking about like the primary thing that person would end up thinking and believing, right? We're just talking about like what a person acting in a reasonable capacity may interpret from it, right? And it's hard for me to not imagine a single universe out of the millions that exist where a reasonable person can't interpret that law to be trying to mitigate gun harm and gun violence, right? Like it's very hard for me to imagine no universe where a reasonable person can make that interpretation.
I guess it's mitigating some gun harm or some violence. I mean, any law that restricts anything that can represent any harm is necessarily mitigating it somehow by limiting it, right?
Yeah, but here we have a decent amount of authority to be able to support that this is actually demonstrably mitigating the harm, right? Like we know, like, we've talked about it previously, right? Like we know that there is evidence to the idea that like having open carrying firearms in public is something which does not mitigate harm and in fact increases the likelihood of harm and death, right? Like we know that seems, at least
that seems to be explicit. My problem is that seems to be explicitly not the case though, because there's no problem with Kyle having that firearm on his own property. There's no problem with him open carrying it for purposes of hunting. There's no problem for older people having those firearms. Like, so it seems like explicitly, if we were just looking at a collection of laws, we would never assume that like this law is trying to curb the use of firearms, but just rather that children, for some reason, have been deemed too irresponsible to use firearms.
Well, I think that's certainly one way that Kyle could have interpreted, right? And I think I'm not disputing that is like something that Kyle could have ended up believing in the end, right? But I think that it's also very hard to divorce that reality from the idea that it never occurred to him whatsoever that this law was aimed at trying to mitigate harm from gun use, right? Like I totally agree that like he could have had this other interpretation of the law to mean that it's actually, like I'm allowed to use it in these other circumstances and I'm allowed to use it. But like we're not talking about hunting, right? We're talking about going to a protest where there's a lot of other people and I can't imagine any other way that he could have used it aside from shooting someone else, right? Like it's not like he was going to go there and then he was just like on his way over to like hunt in the local woods.
The way
like,
to use it, the way that you ideally use open carry in defense is that it's a show force that discourages people from being aggressive.
Right. And I remember I heard that. I think it was in your debate with Vosh, and I remember hearing it, right? But even then, we know that that's not necessarily always the case, right? In fact, like there was like one study, and I don't know, I can send you again, like anything that I am citing to, you can ask me for like citations on, right? But like there was a study that showed that like just by virtue of showing a weapon in public, right, that the mere presence of weapons increase aggressive thoughts, hostile appraisals, and aggression.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but we're getting to such utilitarian levels of ethics that I feel like if I see a security guard on the street with a firearm, all of a sudden I can morally condemn him if somebody attacks him and he's forced to kill that person just by virtue of open carrying. Like I feel like we're a lot of levels removed from like the individual culpability here, where like I can kind of agree with what you're saying on like if I bring out like our big like normative ethics dick and we try to like min-max ethics for all of society, but in terms of like looking at individual actors and having one person who's defending himself against somebody else aggressing, I don't know if I could say, well, actually you should have analyzed like ethics for all of society and figured that maybe in this particular case, just to be clear, your argument is that if Kyle is 18, you'd totally drop all of this. That it literally could have been a 1 month or 1 week difference in age, and your argument on this would completely vanish, right?
Yeah, I don't want to give him a non-answer. The answer is yes, but just by virtue of the fact that the law would no longer be giving him that notice, right? That the existence of the law, because it wouldn't have necessarily applied to him, that he probably would not have paid attention to it in the same way where it does apply to him, right? It's not necessarily saying that the law is like, I mean, like, yeah, like I would say that there is some element that the law is probably unjust and discriminated against him, and I would extend the law to be that no person can open carry in public, and and we'd have like a list of exceptions, right? But I don't know, that also relates to like whether or not police can use force, and that's a whole nother can of worms, right? But I mean, like here, no, I mean, like if we were in a universe where Kyle Rittenhouse was 18, I don't think I wouldn't hold him to the same moral culpability, but not because something magical happens to like his moral character when he turns 18, but just by virtue of the fact that I can't expect him to know about a law that does not apply to him.
Gotcha. Okay. I mean, it feels like this is the point around, I guess, which we'll just, yeah, I don't know if we'll agree. Do you think that any protester out past curfew, like, it just needs to accept whatever harm comes to them, and they don't really have a basis by which to defend themselves since they're breaking the law of being out past curfew?
No, because I think there's a difference in that, like, and again, it depends on, like, now we're getting into like what makes a safety law. In this sense, I think safety laws are afforded like a greater degree of consideration.
You don't think curfews in cities where there have been like widespread riots, you don't think that curfew might be in place for what people feel are safety reasons? That when people are out past night and a lot of people are super riled up, that there's a greater likelihood of violent actions or property damage occurring?
There might be. I have to think more about it. I mean, like, I could see an interpretation of the premises I've laid out that would make those people morally culpable for the harm that might cause them. Now, I would say that there's probably a problem in the law, and that, the law is fundamentally operating against the interests of those protesters who might want to push some other kind of action. But this is something I'd probably have to think more about.
Yeah, because it sounds to me like, this sounds like an easy give me then, because it feels like, if it feels like cities typically implement curfews when they feel like there's been too much like rioting and activity happening past dark. It seems like that seems to be pretty easy to believe. I guess I could be proven wrong by that, but it seems pretty easy to believe that more property damage, more arson, more harm, and more violence probably occurs past curfew when it starts to get darker outside. So it seems like protesters that are violating curfew are standing in opposition to a law that exists for safety. So then I wonder, if they were to be attacked at night and then act in self-defense, are they going to be held to the same standard that you're holding Kyle to, because they seem to be violating a safety law for no good reason?
Without further context on it, I mean, like, I think I agree with that. I think I agree with that interpretation. Again, I'd probably have to think more about that implication, just because I haven't considered this before you said it, but I think that lines up, right? Like, when you're talking about protests, and I know that you've certainly talked a lot about like about criticisms of the protests, right? There probably is some, so like the language I would use would be assuming the risk, right? And there probably is some truth to the idea that, like, if you are going to act unlawfully, that there is some assumption of the risk in, for example, staying out past curfew, right? Yeah. That you might be doing something and you might feel personally justified in it, but there is some level of, like, you are assuming a risk by disregarding the law, that there will be some consequence of that. Now, if what the law is trying to avoid is, now this might also go to like back to the idea of like, what would people think is the purpose of the law, right? Is the purpose of the law to try and avoid harm being incurred by those protesters, or is the purpose of the law trying to avoid harm being incurred to like property or whatever? And that will affect the analysis, because like a big part of the reason why the gun law is so important for me for giving notice, whereas like, the age laws about like children buying video games, is that like the gun law is specifically like a law tailored at trying to prevent the people from breaking it from causing harm to others, and from harm being caused to themselves in that same right? And if the curfew laws are trying to achieve that end, then yeah, I would probably agree with you. And if not, then the analysis for me would be different.
Do you think it's reasonable to assume that every citizen has like this, like, follows like the moral implications behind every single law in order to understand whether or not they can defend themselves in public?
No, I don't think so. And that's why I usually tend to focus on what a reasonable person would believe in an instance, right? That's why with like Kyle and like him being chased in the middle of the street, that's why I don't necessarily like, again, taking that in a vacuum, divorced from the separate circumstance, hold him to be like morally culpable, because did he know for sure whether or not those people were going to actually kill him or not? And did he know whether or not the law was going to be able to protect him? Those are questions I don't think would be reasonable of him to be expected to know in that particular circumstance. And so I think that like the way that he acted, again, divorced from the separate circumstances, are themselves reasonable, right? Or at least he was acting with a reasonable belief that he could have suffered death or grievous bodily harm. So that's why, like, I acknowledge what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I guess my big problem here is that I feel like this is the blame here is fundamentally different when you have an actor involved that is committing some wrong in terms of who gets assigned the blame for this. So, for instance, if you go hiking or rock climbing, like you assume that there's a non-zero chance that something is going to go wrong, and if it does, then like it happens. But we're not going to blame nature for that. Like things can go wrong sometimes. A rock slide happens, or a tree falls over, or a raccoon attacks you. I don't know. Something can happen, and that's just it. But when we're entering into areas with other moral agents, even if we have committed something even if we say we've committed some wrong, that doesn't give an excuse to anybody else to commit a wrong at you, and it certainly doesn't remove your ability to defend yourself. For instance, let's say a girl uses a fake ID to get into a bar that she doesn't belong in. Once she gets into a bar, let's say somebody notices she's underage and tries to sexually assault her, and she defends herself and ends up killing that person. I don't think that she's culpable for that person just because she was in an area where she wasn't supposed to be in. That seems like a really big claim to make. Like, well, she knew that going to that bar, she could have been assaulted, especially being underage. I don't think that I would remove her ability to defend herself there and say, well, no, that's not right because of her first wrong. I just don't. I think you can acknowledge that like maybe a wrong is committed in one area, but that doesn't like bleed over into every single. It's not like a cascading sheet that goes down into every other thing that happens past that point. Is how I view it, I guess.
To jump in real quick, just because you've said this a couple of times and I haven't like commented on it, just to be clear, the reason why a lot of people are against the analogy is A, because it's a rape analogy, but also B, in this conversation got more into the specifics of it. When we're talking about breaking a law regarding safety for a weapon, and then you break that, and we're talking about moral culpability, I feel like that is not comparable to like things you did that may have precluded you to getting raped or something like that.
I disagree. I think you're trying to make it so exactly narrow that I can't make an analogy then. Like if you're literally saying like you can only compare weapons to weapons. What we're talking about is, can you put yourself in an area that maybe you're not supposed to be in that might cause you to cause harm to other people if they attack you? I think that's general enough that it's fine, but I think it's specific enough that it works as well. Like otherwise every analogy I would make would just be a gun analogy, but that's not really an analogy at all, right? Like
when it's area specific, yeah, but then when we start talking about legal defenses and you use it more broadly, I think it's a lot tougher for people to swallow.
Sure, but I think we're still trying to get like at a moral point here. Like if you're in an area you're not supposed to be in, do you have a right to defend yourself from an unjust attacker? And I think the answer to that is always yes, even if you're not supposed to be there.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah,
at least on that principle.
Yeah, go for it.
Divorce from the weight associated with using a rape analogy, like just looking at it, I don't necessarily. Again, like that's the reason why I say like in a vacuum that I don't think that Kyle is necessarily in the wrong for specifically acting in the way that he did. Like for example, let's say that the person charging at him actually was going to end his life, right? I think that the way that Kyle handled himself in that sense, like if that were actually what was going to happen, like he would have prevented his death, right? Like that would have been the actual consequence if that's what one of the people charging at him was actually intending to do, right? I don't think that's, but so I'm not necessarily saying that the people who are charging at him are not morally culpable, at least in some degree. I have to think about that a little bit more. I'm not making them out to be like amoral agents completely. I suppose that what I'm saying here is that like by virtue of, and I would make a little bit of a distinction between like the idea that like we're talking about two different kinds of safety law, I think, right? Or at least two kinds of safety rules. We're talking about like rules which prevent injury to yourself and rules which prevent injury to other people. I suppose what's more important to me are the ones which cause more harm to other people. And I think that that's sort of like the thing that gets over, or at least makes
Sure.
the situation disamalgamous
Yeah,
to the bar situation.
Sure, and I could agree with you there, but if we're talking about laws that prevent injury to other people, then it sounds like the car analogy that I brought up earlier would fit then perfectly for that. Because the reason why we don't let minors drive cars isn't because they can hurt themselves, partially, but it's probably mainly because they can crash into and kill other people that are like totally uninvolved.
Yeah, and again, like with the car, it's trickier, right? Going back to like a car is not expressly used with the intention of harming others, right? Like there are a million reasons to use a car aside from that, and yeah, there are technically other reasons to use a gun, but like it's primarily used as a means to be able to end life, you know. But like even then, I think that there is probably some moral culpability of the person that you described in your hypothetical, right? Like they knew that there is like a policy basis in society that we don't want certain people to drive because there is like a possibility of harming them or causing harm to other people, right? And in that instance, like even if he ultimately decided, even if the person that you described ultimately decided that like, oh well, I know about that, but like I've driven a ton, I live out in the country, this is something that I always do, yada yada yada. Like they still consciously made that decision at some point along the way and assumed that risk, right? And I would say that by making that choice and assuming that risk, that is for me what makes them morally culpable.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Um. Okay. Well, are there any other parts of this that you wanted to visit, or do we hang our hat on this one here?
Let me see. By disregarding. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, like, yeah, if we just fundamentally disagree, I don't know. I just figured I'd try to make the best faith kind of argument I could. And I'm sorry if I wasn't able to convince you, but you know, I hope it's apparent that I tried.
No, it's fine. I don't think you're. Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. A lot of these have been like really heated, so.
Yeah, no, this was chill. I appreciated it.
Do you want to link your channel or anything?
Oh shit. I'm not looking at Twitch right now, but yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Riley Grace Roshong. You can find me, just Google me, YouTube, Twitch. I just reached the 3rd tier on Discord, so discord.gg/RGR. That's pretty bopping. And yeah, no, I hope that, hey, and if we're able to talk again someday, I feel like that'd be cool.
Yeah, if you ever want to, yeah, just hit me up. I'll do these conversations anytime, so yeah. Thanks for the talk, I appreciate it.
Yeah, you too. All right, talk to you later.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Torture your cock and balls must endure. 2 spaces forward, your cock will be stretched.